This is Logan Blackwood, reporting for International Desk. There is a waterway in the Middle East that most people couldn't find on a map 2 years ago. Today, it is the most dangerous stretch of water on the planet. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, has been effectively closed to international shipping. Iranian forces are firing on tankers. 2 Indian-flagged ships were attacked while attempting to cross. 0 tankers made it through on Sunday. Oil is surging toward $100 a barrel, and a ceasefire between the US and Iran expires in 72 hours with no deal in sight. This is not a regional skirmish. This is a direct threat to the global energy supply, and every person on Earth who pays for fuel, food, or electricity is already starting to feel it. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how we got here, why the closure of this waterway is unlike anything the world has seen in decades, and what happens to the global economy if it stays shut. I'm going to show you who is being hurt right now, who is most exposed, and why the next 72 hours may determine whether this situation gets resolved or spirals into something far worse. Stay with me, because the scale of what is unfolding here is not being fully explained anywhere else. I want you to think about your heart for a moment. Your heart pumps blood through arteries to every organ in your body, every cell, every tissue. If blood flows, you function. If blood stops flowing, organs begin to fail, one by one, until the damage becomes irreversible. Now think of the global economy as a body, and think of oil as its blood. The Strait of Hormuz is the main artery. Every single day, roughly 20 million barrels of crude oil pass through that narrow stretch of water. That is approximately 27% of the world's entire seaborne oil trade, moving through a channel that is, at its tightest point, just 21 miles wide. China gets a third of its total oil supply through that strait. Europe gets 12 to 14% of its liquefied natural gas from Qatar through that strait. Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, their entire export infrastructure flows through that strait. When Iran closes it, the artery is blocked. And when an artery is blocked for long enough, the damage stops being temporary. Now let's establish exactly what happened and why this moment is different from every previous Hormuz crisis. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated military strikes on Iran under an operation called Epic Fury. The targets included Iran's command and control centers, missile sites, naval vessels, and nuclear facilities. Iran's supreme leader was killed in the strikes. Iran's response was immediate and strategic. Missile barrages hit U.S. bases across the Gulf, in the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain. Houthi forces in Yemen resumed attacks on Red Sea shipping, and Iran turned its attention to the one weapon it has held in reserve for decades, the Strait of Hormuz. By March 4th, Iranian forces declared the strait closed. They began targeting vessels attempting to transit. Tanker traffic dropped first by 70%, then to virtually zero. More than 2,000 ships and 20,000 crew members became stranded inside the Persian Gulf, unable to leave, unable to continue, caught in the middle of a conflict with no timeline for resolution. But here's where it gets worse. The situation was already catastrophic in March. What happened this past weekend pushed it into an entirely different category. Iran briefly announced it would reopen the strait. Markets surged, the world exhaled, and within 48 hours, it was closed again. This time in direct retaliation for the U.S. seizure of an Iranian cargo ship in the Gulf of Oman. Iran's military said explicitly that as long as U.S. blockades prevent Iranian ships from moving freely, no one moves freely through Hormuz. On Saturday, 2 Indian-flagged ships came under fire while attempting to cross. India summoned Iran's ambassador in New Delhi. The UK's Maritime Trade Operations Center confirmed a separate incident in which Iranian gunboats fired on a tanker. Audio from maritime monitoring systems captured a crew member transmitting a live distress call, telling Iranian naval forces that they had been given clearance and were now being fired upon. This is not a blockade on paper. This is active enforcement with live weapons against civilian vessels. Let's go through the receipts. Receipt number 1. What Iran is actually doing inside the strait and why it is working. Iran has the longest coastline of any country bordering the Persian Gulf. Its military assets, gunboats, anti-ship missiles, mines, and IRGC naval forces give it the ability to make transit through Hormuz dangerous enough that commercial operators simply stop trying. You don't need to sink every ship. You just need to make insurers refuse to cover the crossing. That is exactly what happened. War risk insurance premiums for tankers attempting to transit the strait surged from 0.125% of vessel value to between 0.2 and 0.4% per transit. For a very large oil tanker, That is an increase of $250,000 per crossing, before you even factor in the risk of being fired upon. Major shipping firms suspended operations entirely. The math became simple. The risk was greater than the reward. Reports also emerged that Iran had laid mines in sections of the Strait. President Trump himself responded on social media, warning that if Iran did not remove those mines, military consequences would follow at a level, he wrote, never seen before. And here is something most channels are not talking about. Iraq and Kuwait, two countries with no direct role in this conflict, began curtailing their own oil production in early March because their storage facilities were filling up with crude they simply had no way to export. When a country that produces millions of barrels of oil per day is forced to shut down its wells, not because of damage or sanctions, but because the exit route is blocked, that tells you everything about the scale of this disruption. Receipt number 2. What this is doing to oil markets and what it means for your daily life. The numbers are stark. West Texas Intermediate crude, the U.S. benchmark, has risen roughly 41% since the airstrikes began in late February. Brent crude, the international standard, is now approaching $97 a barrel after surging 7% in a single day following the latest closure. U.S. gasoline prices hit a national average of $4.05 per gallon on Sunday. The Energy Secretary told reporters that prices may not return below $3 a gallon until next year. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas published an economic analysis that put hard numbers to the worst-case scenario. If the Strait of Hormuz remains closed for a full quarter, just 3 months, the model projects WTI oil reaching $98 a barrel and global real GDP growth falling by nearly 3 percentage points on an annualized basis. If it stays closed for 3 quarters, 9 months, the reduction in global growth climbs to 1.3 percentage points for the full year. And that is just the oil impact. The Strait also carries 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas. It handles roughly 30% of globally traded fertilizers, urea, ammonia, the inputs that farmers on every continent depend on to grow food. The spring planting season is happening right now. The UN has already intervened to request humanitarian fertilizer shipments be allowed through, because without them, food production shortfalls become a real and near-term risk. But here's where it gets worse. This is not only a story about fuel prices and commodity markets. President Trump argued publicly that the Hormuz closure doesn't really affect the United States the way it affects other countries, pointing to America's domestic oil production as a buffer. Economists pushed back immediately. Because oil is a global commodity, it doesn't matter where you produce it. When supply drops anywhere, prices rise everywhere. The U.S. has already seen that 50-cent plus spike at the pump. American families are paying it right now. Businesses dependent on fuel, shipping, and manufacturing are absorbing costs they cannot pass on indefinitely. The idea that this is someone else's problem is not supported by the data. Receipt number 3. The global reaction and the diplomatic picture heading into the most critical 72 hours of this conflict. China's President Xi Jinping personally called Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to demand that normal passage through Hormuz be restored. Xi called for an immediate ceasefire and made clear that Beijing, which receives a third of its oil through the Strait, views the ongoing disruption as a direct threat to its national interests. When the leader of the world's second-largest economy makes a personal call to the leader of its largest oil supplier, specifically about a waterway in a conflict involving the United States, the message being sent is not subtle. India summoned Iran's ambassador after Indian-flagged ships came under fire. European governments are watching LNG supplies with growing alarm. Iraq and Kuwait have lost their export infrastructure through no fault of their own. The countries most dependent on Gulf energy, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the entire industrial base of East Asia, are watching their energy security deteriorate in real time. And what most people are missing is this. The ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran expires this Wednesday. Peace talks that were supposed to begin in Pakistan this week, involving Vice President Vance, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner, are now in serious doubt after Iran indicated it would not attend. The Iranian government has publicly stated it declined to join. The ceasefire has already been violated, according to both sides, with each blaming the other. Wednesday is not a faraway deadline. Wednesday is tomorrow, if no deal is reached, if no extension is announced, if Iran retaliates for the ship seizure and the U.S. responds in kind. The fragile framework that has been holding this conflict inside a defined set of boundaries begins to collapse. And when that framework collapses, the assumptions that markets, governments, and military planners have been operating on collapse with it. The Dallas Fed's model assumed a quarter of closure. We are already past that point. Every additional day the Strait remains closed, every additional ship that gets fired upon, every additional diplomatic failure adds weight to a structure that is already under enormous strain. If this is connecting dots you haven't seen anywhere else, subscribe to International Desk right now. Hit the bell. Because this story is accelerating, and you need to be here when the next development breaks. Here is where we stand. The Strait of Hormuz, the artery that carries 27% of the world's seaborne oil, is effectively closed. 2,000 ships are trapped, 20,000 sailors are stranded, oil is near $100 a barrel, gas is above $4. A ceasefire expires in 72 hours. Peace talks are collapsing. And the two militaries at the center of this conflict are operating in the same narrow waterway with no agreement, no framework, and no clear path forward. This is not a crisis that started this weekend. This is a crisis that has been building for 2 months and may be reaching its most dangerous inflection point yet. The world has tried diplomacy. It has tried ceasefires. It has tried partial reopenings. Every attempt has been reversed within days. Something has to give. The only question is what? I'm Logan Blackwood. This has been International Desk, and this might only be the beginning.